Hello, I'm Darren Grimes and welcome to Reasoned UK. Please do consider hitting that subscribe button and the notification bell if you enjoy today's show, which I'm absolutely certain that you will, because boy oh boy am I excited about this one. I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by the Cambridge historian Professor Robert Toombs, who joins me to discuss his new book out later this month, The Sovereign Isle, Britain in and Out of Europe. The book aims to put Brexit in its historical context. So, without further ado, hello, Robert.
Hello, Darren.
How are you doing? Is lockdown driving you a little bit mad yet, or what?
I think I've had enough of it now.
Yeah.
Just let me get the book done. But now that's done, yes, time to move on.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, Robert, before we discuss the themes around the book that you've just mentioned, The Sovereign Isle, Britain in and Out of Europe, I wonder if we might reflect on what 2020 meant for British history in your eyes, or at least the displaying of said history in some of our most cherished institutions. It strikes me that from museums to universities, even the civil service, for goodness sake, have been hell-bent on propagating a sort of curated version of history, and one that's uniquely negative about Britain and its past. And without sounding too much like a shrink, Robert, I wonder how much does that make you feel, and why do you think it's happening?
It seems to be happening in all Western countries, and certainly in all English-speaking countries. And why it is, I think, is certainly a very interesting question. But it seems to be aiming at breaking down a sense, obvious, of national identity, pride, solidarity, whatever you want to call it, and substituting some form of fragmented identity politics. I mean, I think, as you say, Britain has come in for this quite a lot. Not that this is new, but I think Australia and the United States have had it worse, in a sense. And some of the countries a few years ago, particularly France, went through a similar kind of process. Though France now is facing very different and much more serious problems. You know, I think if one were relatively complacent, as I'm afraid I tend to be, I would think a lot of this is just froth. It's fashionable people in fashionable institutions desperate to prove their fashionability, if you like. I don't think it touches most people, and I very much doubt, or at least I very much hope, it will not have a significantly damaging effect, because I think you would have to. I mean, I hope we'll get on to the actual history in a sense, but this is, as I think you implied, politics, and I think one really ought to ask, what is the political purpose of this campaign? And a simplistic answer would be, it means it's because we have to get in touch with our past or face up to our past crimes, etc. Yes. Which I think has been done for a long time. But I don't think that can be the real reason. If that's not too arrogant for me to imply that other people are doing things for reasons they don't wholly avow. But I mean, I think there is an attempt to. It's a political campaign, and I would like to have people looking at its political motives and actually saying what they think the object of what they're doing is. What sort of society are they trying to create? What is the purpose of trying to break down a sense of national identity, or at least to undermine it? And what do they think is going to be the outcome of this?
Because if we think about the aim of education itself, and I dare say the goal of any historian worth their salt aims to inform and provoke people, right? But surely this curation of half-truths is quite the opposite of that. Surely it's infantilizing, patronizing, and only giving people half the picture.
Yes, I think it is, and deliberately so. History should be, history serves a lot of purposes, including entertainment. But one thing it should do is shake our own complacency about our own values, I think. And the idea that somehow the 21st century is morally superior to everything that's gone before, and that the values we've often quite recently invented somehow have universal application, seems to me a very strange view. It's an odd contradiction that people who often condemn universalism, or what they think of as the universalism of Western civilization, have their own form of universalism, which is to propagate a certain number of basic ideas and values which most people don't accept. And some of these are based on, as you say, an extremely, I don't know. Your word "curated" is very good. I mean, you could say a censored view or a deliberately biased view of history. Yes.
Yes. We'll probably get into a bit more of the history and why these people are quite wrong to sort of pick the United Kingdom out as a uniquely pernicious, I guess, purveyor of evil throughout the world. But if we move on to Brexit, and I guess some have argued that Brexit, speaking of history, has been historically determined because of our history, character, and I guess actually exceptionalism, for want of another word. But you argue that this really isn't the case. I wonder if you might just reflect on why that is.
Yes, I'd like to. But could I just say there may be a link with Brexit and the present campaign? I mean, it's not very clear, except some of the same people are involved. But the sense that Brexit was a revival of nationalist populism,
yes,
which many people said. Therefore, what you have to do is try to break down this nationalist populism by saying to people, your national history is terrible and you should be ashamed of it. It should not be something that motivates you politically. I mean, that would be the most obvious political explanation of it.
Yeah.
Yes, I do downplay the exceptionalism view. I guess it's partly that I'm a European historian. Most of my career has been studying France and other parts of Europe and teaching that. And so I tend to always look at British history and English experience within a wider, particularly European context. And I think Brexit is exactly the same. When we voted for Brexit, we did not do so because we are different from all other Europeans. In fact, the vote for Brexit seems to me very clearly something that could have happened in any European country. I don't always invoke President Macron in support of what I say, but in this case, you may remember he told Andrew Marr in 2018 that the French would have liked to have a referendum, and he said they would have voted to leave the EU, or he said at least it would have been a very difficult referendum to win. So I think one has to look at opinion about the EU all across Europe, and the fact is and it's proved umpteen times by the EU's own opinion polling organisation, which is very interesting and worth looking at, that confidence in the idea of the EU and of Europe peaked in the 1990s, and therefore for 30 years has been declining. And people across Europe who express confidence in the EU are now in a minority. And in some countries, confidence in the EU is much lower than indeed in Britain. So the simple answer to why we voted for Brexit is, first of all, we were given the opportunity to vote, or at least we were required to vote. In my own case, I sort of hesitated about whether this was the right time to do it and whether we should wait. But as one of my colleagues said, this is the moment we have to decide. We may not have another chance to decide, so it had to be then. And because we're not members of the Euro, countries in which the EU is far more unpopular than it was in Britain. France is one, Greece is another, Italy is another, would not feel it possible to leave because the dangers of leaving the Euro, giving up the Euro currency, somehow having to improvise your own currency, seem to threaten an economic and financial collapse of the state finances, but also I think we should remember of people's own savings. If you've got a few thousand euros in the bank, you don't want it suddenly to halve in value if it's turned into drachmas. So I think for many people, this was something that they just could not contemplate. And you saw that in France. Marine Le Pen was campaigning in the last presidential election on an anti-EU ticket. But when she was asked what the French would do about the euro, I mean, in a sense, her whole campaign collapsed. There's an obvious comparison here with Scottish independence.
Currency,
the question of the currency. What do you do about your money? And there's simply no answer to that, or at least not an answer that most people could accept or understand. You could say, well, it's been done. Countries have improvised overnight a new currency. But if you're Greece or Italy, the dangers of doing that are huge, indeed, and France too. So I think the idea that you would take that leap in the dark is something that most people, even people who don't like the EU, would hesitate very much to do. Whereas we, of course, could do it. Okay, people said it's going to cause you to lose. Your GDP will be 3% smaller in 15 years' time than it would otherwise have been, or something like that. But that's nothing like saying, overnight your savings might halve and the financial system might collapse. So I think we simply had the liberty to do what many people in Europe would quite like to do.
Well, actually, I've got two questions from what you've just said there. Then the first being that somewhat rather defeats the caricature of the United Kingdom's vote for Brexit as a particularly xenophobic, insular and racist even one, because if the same concerns about the European project are shared throughout many member states of the EU 27, then it strikes me that we're not all that different after all, right? And then secondly, as far as the Euro's concerned, had Tony Blair got his way, it seems to me that you're suggesting that Brexit would not have happened. Well, it certainly
Yes,
wouldn't have happened right now. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I do. In fact, in my book that you kindly mentioned, I do argue very strongly that this is not at all an exceptionalist decision. And of course, this cuts both ways. Those Remainers who said this is an example of terrible British or English, in particular, bigotry, racism, etc., then you say, well, if that's the case of Britain or of England, then it must be the case of the whole of the EU, practically. In other words, we're no different. But also, of course, that means that those of us on the Brexit side who like to say it's all down to the common law and our proud history of parliamentary sovereignty and all that, you'd also have to say, well, no, really, because we're not very different from the other countries of Europe. And of course, many of those countries have a history of national struggles for independence, at least as proud as ours, and in some ways much more heroic than ours. You only have to think of Poland and the terrible history of Polish struggles for independence over the last 200 years and more to think, well, can we say that we are more attached to our independence than the Poles are, and yet the Poles are at least unhappy, but still solid members of the EU? So, I think you have to look at it both ways and say, well, it was a decision that was made in 2016 in particular circumstances, which at that time reflected views in Britain that were shared very widely across the EU. Now, have those views changed? I think they have, certainly in the short term, in that the Brexit has been presented all across Europe in the mainstream media as being a disaster. And of course, it did cause huge, as we know, political conflict within this country.
That's
and therefore,
the despite Brexit phenomenon, as I like to call it.
Yes, of course, yes. We're now getting to very much. No queues at Dover. But I think it was presented, and many of my friends in I have a lot of French friends, German. They still are expecting some sort of collapse. Are you running out of food yet? And that sort of thing. It's presented to them as such a horror show that I think it's certainly, for the time being, boosted acceptance of the EU as being something that you can't actually get out of without huge damage. And for many countries, I think that would be true. I did write somewhere that if France did a Frexit, you'd probably have blood in the streets, and I think you would have to face up to that possibility, which I think many people in Europe are not. Which is not to say that they think that the EU is a great idea, but it's that they feel that this is something that they're stuck with, and that they've got to somehow live with, and that was simply not our case.
Surely it's a concern for the EU then that because it's beat the drum of saying how terrible Brexit is going to be, and how your friends on the continent, and I doubt they're alone or isolated cases in believing that the UK is going to struggle, even to the point where they believe that starvation might be imminent. What happens then, I wonder, for the continent or the European project if Brexit turns out to actually be quite successful. And I think you would sort of measure success, at least in the short to medium term, around what the EU can do as a nation state outside of the constraints of sort of what I would describe as almost technocratic imperialism. And as far as the vaccines concerned, Robert, as well, procurement of the vaccine, the UK streets ahead of the EU. And I'm wondering, do you foresee any sort of a grand awakening, I guess, of Euroscepticism across the continent?
That's quite. I think the answer is, in a sense, yes. But then there's a lot of Euroscepticism across the continent anyway.
Already, yeah.
The question is what you think you can do about it, if anything. I agree that the vaccine thing seems to have had quite an impact, though I listen to the French news quite a lot, and it's interesting that they've been treating this question very carefully. Though I think in Germany there's been much more criticism of the EU and its failures, but in France it's been said, well, the EU is acting with solidarity. It's acting much more cautiously than the British, who rushed into this, that kind of thing. But I think the penny has dropped, that the EU has been again a failure in procuring vaccine, as it has really been a failure in providing economic and financial support due to the COVID pandemic, as it was a failure in coping with the financial crisis in 2007, 2008. So when will the penny drop? I mean, who knows? I mean, my guess is that it will not happen overnight, though, there could be another EU or Euro crisis in the coming year, and this could be contributed to by the slowness of the EU to emerge from the pandemic, particularly in certain countries. I mean, even a month or a couple of months delay is going to have huge effects on the economy and on their financial situation, which is already very precarious. So there could be another Euro crisis, and in that case, I think a lot of people would start saying this system is not viable. And as you suggest, if we seem to be doing better, or at least if we have not collapsed, as some of my friends were expecting, then you'll have people saying, well, maybe this is not such a bad thing after all. Again, but then the question remains, what can you do about it politically and financially when you're so much within the financial grip of EU institutions, which, as you suggested, is a sort of technocratic oligarchy in which decisions are made. I mean, it always astonishes me that many liberal Remainers, if there are still people who are called Remainers, or liberal admirers of the EU, seem pretty indifferent to, I think, the undeniable fact that the EU is run, and always has been run, in a way that is oligarchical, technocratic, and fundamentally undemocratic, in which, as has been said over and over again, decisions which ought to be taken democratically are taken in secret by ministers, heads of government, meeting in secret, reaching some sort of consensus, which often means doing what France and Germany say, which there is Yanis Varoufakis, in his books on this, has shown this very clearly, what it's like to be the representative of a smaller country and simply being told that this is what you will do, or your economy will melt down. And yet people seem to be pretty indifferent to this. What does it matter, because it's a wonderful project? Don't ask too many awkward questions about how it actually operates.
Yeah.
And of course, for some countries, it operates fairly well, as long as you're happy to see decisions made by an oligarchy. For other countries, it clearly operates very badly. And what do they do about it? Well, the answer is, so far, it seems that they can do absolutely nothing about it.
Yeah.
And that the consequence is impoverishment, inequality, high levels of youth unemployment, and for the foreseeable future.
And that's what happens when you lose control over your currency, or indeed your own currency altogether. You know, it's a straitjacket of the euro. It's a very, my heart breaks for the likes of Greece. You know, but if we go back to, I guess, if you look back over the last 4 years, the likes of John Major and others, elder statesmen, former prime ministers, comparing the Brexit battles to that of the English Civil War, and I'm no historian, but this strikes me for reasons that are, I think, probably obvious to most, if not all, viewers, to be quite dramatic hyperbole. And I wonder, Robert, are there any useful historic analogies for what we've experienced over the past 4 years?
Well, perhaps I shouldn't say this as a professional historian, but I think people do well to steer clear of historical analogies,
Okay.
which are always used for rhetorical purposes and not for analytical purposes. And people say this is the worst. This was the worst political crisis we've had since the Civil War, or whatever, or indeed since 1940. Well, I'm old enough to remember the miners' strike, which I'd have thought was far worse. The 4-day week, I'd have said that was far worse. The Suez crisis, far worse as an international fiasco than anything that happened over Brexit. You think, well, people have short memories, or they simply are picking on the examples that they think suit their case.
Yeah.
I don't think anything like the Civil War, except perhaps in one sense. I mean, in my book, I paraphrase Marx, who occasionally said some quite funny things, and one was that history repeats itself, first as tragedy, then as farce. And I think the antics of the House of Commons under Mr. Speaker Bercow had a sort of superficial resemblance to the House of Commons in the 1640s, but of course in a farcical way. And what they were doing was trying to seize power from the executive very, very blunderingly and incompetently, which they had no right to do. They had no constitutional or legal or historical right to do. And that was what had happened in the Civil War. But then in the Civil War, we know this was the bloodiest single episode in history. Fortunately, and this I think we can take some pride in, although people's feelings were heightened over Brexit on both sides, and I include myself in that, and I said some quite cutting things, which perhaps in reflection I'd tone down a bit, but nobody got killed. There was hardly any violence. And I think that says, and indeed the demonstrations were fairly good-humoured. People, although they sometimes got annoyed with each other and even families quarrelled, people's relationships were on the whole quite civil in face-to-face. And if one compares this with my second homeland, as it were, France, in which I think 11 people lost their lives during the Gilets jaunes demonstrations, and of course in America recently, well, I think we can feel some relief and perhaps pride in our civic culture that means that people do not use violence even when they feel quite strongly about.
There was, of course, the murder of the MP Joe Cox during the referendum itself, and a lot of, I guess, Remain campaigners reference that to say that it had released a valve of something quite evil in the British body politic.
Yes, I think that was. Well, I mean, I can understand that people were very shocked by this, and it was a shocking incident.
Of course.
Well, I mean, a tragedy. But I mean, what was reported of the murderer was that he was, well, first of all, obviously mentally unbalanced. He had been planning to kill someone for a long time, it seems. He had no links with any British political movement. His political sympathies, such as they were with American and South African fascists. I mean, the Brexit referendum provided an excuse for someone who wanted to kill. I don't think this can be taken as anything that says anything about our political culture generally. No. And I think it was very responsible, perhaps not so much in the case of Joe Cox, but in other cases in which people tried to make all sorts of generalizations about violence and hatred, which proved on investigation to be completely hollow. And yet they kept repeating stories. I heard this was actually in Italy, a big public sort of debate in Italy, in which somebody said, England has become a hellhole of racist violence or something like that. And I heard in France a former Labour minister, better not say his name, saying exactly the same thing. Britain's become a dreadful place full of hatred and bigotry. Words to that effect. And I said, why are you saying these untruths when you must know that is simply not the case?
They're willing them to be true.
Well, I hope they're not. But I think, sometimes one feels that there's a kind of gleeful anticipation of disaster, which is very unpleasant. I mean, okay, you could say, well, on your side, there are people who are hoping that the EU will be a disaster. That's not how I feel. I feel very worried about the EU, and I think it's very urgent for it to rethink itself, and really to try to end what seems to me its pretty disastrous career towards greater centralisation. But there seems to be little chance of that happening.
How does Britain's very different experience of the 20th century still impact us today? And possibly if we consider the Second World War, and by the way, I've no doubt, Robert, that we've got any Remain Back in viewers watching this, and I'll get messages saying, here we go again, Brexiteers discussing the war. You're obsessed. You people are obsessed. Wait, he's going to invoke Churchill any second now. The Empire. Yes, exactly. But if you consider the view of much of the continent that the EU is so very important because it was a project designed to prevent another war, and the UK as a country much less traumatized by that experience, albeit the cost still being of course very, very great, surely we were always destined to be unruly tenants inside a club that we didn't view as a necessary straitjacket to prevent us from declaring war.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. I think that our different experience of the last century means that our feelings, okay, this is a big generalization. It's not true of everyone, but it's true of most people. I think our feelings about the EU are much less, in a sense, emotional. Okay, this is what everyone says, but I think it's true, that our relationship with the whole idea of European integration was much more transactional. What do we get out of it? Does it work? Is it economically beneficial? Not the feeling that many people in Europe understandably have, that this is saving them from the return of, a terrible disaster. I don't think it's the same feeling everywhere. But the EU does certainly benefit from this sense that it has turned a page on a very a disastrous century. If you live in Spain or Portugal or indeed Greece, then the EU is, for some people, what saves you from a return possibly to dictatorship. If you're in Eastern Europe, it's what saves you possibly from a return to communist rule or dominance by Russia, something like that. If you're German, okay, it saves you from your history. If you're French, it ideally enables you to get a grip on Germany, which has been such a threat to you over the last 150 years. So I think, there are lots of historical understandings of what the EU is or should be, which go very deep, and which I think you're right in saying that on the whole we don't share. If you were to ask, what is our kind of mythology of the 20th century? Well, I think you would have to say it's about how, well, okay, we were victorious, certainly, therefore a kind of vindication of our national history. But also we were victorious with the help of a lot of people outside Europe. The empire, the Commonwealth, of course, above all, America. And so when people, I think of what keeps us safe, what is the foundation of our security as a country, they don't think of the EU, whereas many people in Europe would think of the EU. Our views of the EU were at one level not very different from those in Europe. In other words, do you think the EU is a good thing or a bad thing? About the same number of people say a bad thing. But for the people who feel some commitment to the EU, who may be a minority in all countries, at least a strong commitment, I think they're rather different. They're rather differently weighted in Europe from here. I mean, we, with our different sense of history, if you like, might, as I suggested earlier, have found ourselves stuck inside, however we felt about it, even if we had, even if we were convinced that the EU was not saving us from war, we might still have got stuck inside it because of our financial fears. And a country like Poland, which is clearly struggling a bit with its European membership for lots of reasons, nevertheless, it seems to be and I don't know much about Poland, probably fears that the EU is its fundamental, or one of its fundamental security pillars against the possible dominance by Russia. So those sorts of fears we simply don't have, or most of us don't have. I think 5% of the population say they identify strongly with the EU as an idea. If you went to other European countries, you'd find the figure much higher. You'd find a similar figure of people who don't like it, but you'd find more people who strongly do like it.
Mm. Yes, exactly. There are precious few Guy Verhofstadts across the continent, basically, is what you're saying, but there's still a very different understanding of why the EU is important and part of, a national character, if not identity. But I think,
exactly.
Do you think, Robert, that Brexit will be viewed as such an important event in our history? Because, as I mentioned earlier, Brexit being a vote for the nation state, the independent nation over what I would describe as technocratic hubris. I wonder how long it'll be before we actually know whether the project itself will be successful. How long does it take for these sorts of events to feed through and for be able to turn around as a nation and say, well, actually, we did the right thing there? Will the likes of Speaker Bercow still be remembered in years to come? How long will it take?
Well, I rather hope it won't be remembered too much, because we're not a very historical nation. I mean, we like the past. People like visiting old houses and so on, but I don't think we have much of a sense of our history as a continuing subject. And the things we mainly remember are the disasters. So people remember the war. So if Brexit passes off fairly smoothly, I don't think it will probably leave much of a trace in 50 years' time, any more than the repeal of the court. People don't lie awake thinking, oh God, did we do the right thing in the 1840s about repealing the Corn Law? So you could ask that question. I sort of guess that most people don't even realise that Ireland was ever part of the UK, or that people thought that the independence of Ireland would be the beginning of the end. How many people in England, at least, know anything about the Irish Troubles, the Irish War of Independence? I mean, I guess hardly any do, and yet it was a hugely traumatic episode. So unless Brexit turns out to be a hugely traumatic episode, which I don't believe it will, I think it will become one of those things that people have a vague sense of, but think, oh, well, yeah, obviously that was the right thing to do. Mm-hmm. That's what I hope. Partly that, of course, does depend on the EU. If the EU turns out to be a brilliant success, and I must admit I can't really see how that can happen, but imagine it did happen, that in 20 years' time the EU was rich, peaceful, powerful, influential, happy, etc., and we were stuck on the outside regretting it, then people would remember it. If, on the other hand, the EU continues to have an unending series of crises, then I really can't see that people are going to say, oh dear, how awful that we left. I mean, I think the EU is likely to be continuingly unsuccessful, and I find it hard to see why its great enthusiasts can't see its problems.
Yes, and if we consider actually that I think we've already seen a divergence actually, and it strikes me as far as foreign policy is concerned, a country like Britain, who, as you mentioned earlier, uniquely, I think, had links all over the world, not just concentrated on one continent. if you look at what the EU's done as far as its trade pact with China's concerned, and whilst we have actually made moves to ban Chinese imports linked to forced labour in China, do you see this divergence continuing as the UK seeks alliances old and new further afield? Because I don't know about you, Robert, but my understanding is that as far as foreign policy is concerned, the UK hasn't had one for almost 50 years.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think okay, you could say, well, our foreign policy has been to be a good member of the EU, which we didn't really succeed in, and to be America's closest ally. But it seems to me that's not really a foreign policy. It's in some ways an excuse for not having a foreign policy. It's trying to be good members of the club, and I think and hope we shall have to make big decisions. Now, there is a view that, of course, now we are outside the EU, we will be less important and less influential, and therefore our decisions will be made for us by others. It seems to me that that's probably not how it's going to be, for two reasons. I think you may well be right about the EU becoming more dependent on Russia for its energy and on China for its trade. And it may well be that, if China continues to behave in the way it has been, that we shall find ourselves reducing our links with China, as will some other Western countries, and often those Western countries with which we shall probably be more closely aligned. Obviously, the United States, but also other countries like Australia and so on. India, who knows? But relations between India and China are clearly very tense, as they are with Japan. So, we may end up, and we must all hope that this will not lead to another world conflict, but at least we may end up in some sort of Cold War. I don't underestimate Britain's potential leadership role and its authority. I think we tend to underestimate our real power and influence, and have done for a very long time.
I mean, some have argued that actually a United States of Europe is completely inevitable, and that we will, in being late to join in the first place, be late to rejoin the superstates that can take on the likes of China. And I mean, surely they're sort of taking on the role of clairvoyance here, because that's surely just as unpredictable as the British exit ultimately was, which you say wasn't a done deal,
Yeah, I mean, as you said earlier, I'm a historian, and historians rightly don't like foretelling the future, because one thing that history does teach you is that things that happen are unpredictable. There are too many imponderables. Nobody expected the First World War. Nobody expected the COVID epidemic, or at least they didn't expect it enough. You just cannot predict these things, and therefore people whose predictions of the future are based on an extrapolation of the present or the recent past are almost bound to be wrong, or at least to get their timings hugely wrong. But it's still, as far as I could see, if I took a guess, it would be that the idea of a powerful United States of Europe is now past. If it was ever possible, it's no longer possible. And what I think we will get at most is, and many others have made this comparison, something like the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the late 19th century. A coalition of very different, culturally different and politically and economically different states who were held together partly by their inability to do anything else, but which were constantly quarrelling, and which were not therefore able to exert the real authority that their numerical and even economic weight suggested. And I think that's likely to be the future of the EU. Of course, the Austro-Hungarian Empire ended in disaster, and we all hope the EU won't end in disaster. But the idea that you can base a United States of Europe on a purely, not purely, let's say, there is a parliament and we do have elections, but on a largely oligarchical and secret system of politics, which is something unlike anything that we have known in democratic history, and which seems to me to fly in the face of Europe's own best political traditions, which are of a popular sovereignty, of democracy. I just can't see that this is a viable basis for a future great nation. And then, of course, you assume that the age of democracy is over and that China is our new model. But then the idea that the EU will become like China is equally a fantasy. It's sort of had a model which would be like the United States of America. Well, it's nothing like the United States of America, and even that as a model is not terribly inspiring at the moment. But it's hard to see what sort of system the EU is trying to be. At the moment, it seems to be a bureaucratic structure with a few pseudo-democratic, bit of democratic window dressing, and I can't see that is going to last forever.
This isn't an especially profound question, so please do forgive me if it sounds really reductive. But just how much does being an island nation impact our history and character?
Well, I think hugely. It's quite hard to imagine, I think, what it means to be living on an island, because it's for us the natural state of affairs. But if you go to a country like Luxembourg, which I went to for the first time a few months ago, you realise that how much being part of a European system is essential to its whole sense of what it is, surrounded by, landlocked, surrounded by other countries, dependent on other countries for its security and its existence. You can't really imagine Luxembourg ever being a truly independent sovereign country. If you were brought up in Strasbourg, if you were my age in Strasbourg in 1944, you would have changed nationalities 4 or 5 times in your life. Many parts of Europe have overlapping and even conflicting cultural identities, in which you're expected to speak 2 or 3 languages, or at least that was once the case, much less so now because of ethnic cleansing, but in which the idea that there would be some sort of overarching European identity that could solve all these problems for you is hugely attractive for many people. Okay, maybe a minority of people, but those kinds of problems, that kind of diversity even, is not one that we share, and therefore living on the edge is inevitably makes our sense of ourselves and our history very different. If you think of Europe as a whole now, which are the countries which are least integrated into the EU? It's Switzerland, Norway, the Scandinavian countries, and those on the eastern edge. It's all those that are to some extent on the edge, as we are, and being on the edge certainly gives you a different sense of what it is to be European, and of your relations with the outside world, which you mentioned earlier. And that, I think, is the other, and perhaps even the most important aspect of our island history in the last 300 years, is the extent and the depth of our relationships with other parts of the world.
Yeah,
I mean, it's not unique, because other countries in Europe have links too. Italy, Spain, Portugal, France, etc. I would say ours are more extensive, deeper, and simply more important than those of other semi-global European countries.
What do you think throughout history explains the Scottish Nationalist desire to leave the political and economic union of the United Kingdom, to rejoin the EU? Many have argued, and I think rightly so, that it's surely inconsistent with independence to leave our political and economic union with a great deal of autonomy to join one like the EU with increasingly less.
Yeah, I think that's true. Yes, I mean, I think, of course, the desire for Scottish independence is recent. It's pretty recent, and I think very
But there is a
clearly
sort of
it's.
romanticization of history,
Oh,
isn't
yeah,
there? Yeah, yeah.
sure, yeah, sure, certainly there is. But then you can feel. I mean, when I used to lecture on nationalism, I used to ask the class, "What's the difference between a Scottish patriot and a Scottish nationalist?" And they often hadn't thought there was a difference. And of course, the difference is you can love Scotland, you can love Scottish history, you can be very proud of yourselves as a Scot with Scottish identity and all that, without being a Scottish nationalist who wants Scotland to be separated from the United Kingdom. And most Scottish patriotism since since the 18th century has been quite compatible with British patriotism. Indeed, the Scots were, I guess most people don't know this, but the Scots were the country in which the highest proportion of the population volunteered for the army in the First World War. Scotland was very much part of Britain, of the United Kingdom, of the Empire. And okay, all those things you could say have been weakened in recent years for all of us, partly because we have no obvious external threat. And there's nothing like an external threat to keep you together. We have had that, but I think the thing, it seems to me very obviously, that has stimulated the Scottish desire for independence is membership of the EU. In that sense, Scotland is very comparable, it seems to me, with Catalonia. Um, because if you're a small nation within the EU, now, as you've said, that doesn't give you much real autonomy, but it gives your politicians a big sense of their importance. It gives you might become president of the European Commission when you leave politics. You might become head of the EU's diplomatic commissioner, diplomatic service, and so on, as Irish politicians have often done. And I can see the attractions for politicians from small countries. After all, Jean-Claude Juncker, former Prime Minister of Luxembourg, was very importantly head of the European Commission. So you can imagine that Nicola Sturgeon, and I don't wish to cast aspersions on her motivation, but you can see how in future she might think, well, when I've given up Scottish politics, I'll have a great career in the EU. And all of a sudden, this is being taken away. It becomes more and more difficult for Scotland to become independent after Brexit, it seems to me. Okay, you could say, well, the Scottish nationalists are very annoyed about Brexit, and I quite understand that. But I think that their annoyance is because it makes independence pretty unfeasible. The thing that worries me is not so much that Scotland breaks away, because I think it would be a crazy decision if they did, but that Scotland will remain as a discontented member of the United Kingdom. And I think that's the problem for future UK governments, more than preventing a breakaway, because I just find it impossible really to imagine the Scottish electorate voting for independence, particularly after the Brexit deal. Is the EU going to welcome them with open arms? Probably not.
Robert, it strikes me that, and this is purely anecdotal, but it strikes me that speaking to my family back home in the northeast of England, the English are more likely to vote Scotland out of the Union of the United Kingdom at the moment. There seems to be real sort of anger at this sort of, I guess, Scotland wanting to have its cake and eat it, even with the Barnett formula and all the rest of it.
I think there is a danger that the English electorate will become so impatient with what they see as unreasonable demands by Scottish nationalists that the UK government, under pressure from English voters, will become more and more unyielding towards nationalist demands.
Yeah.
And whether that would push the Scots towards independence, even I doubt it. But it would make the whole United Kingdom a very difficult and unpleasant structure. So I think we have to solve the problem of Scottish nationalism in a sense. But I hope, if Brexit is a success, that the advantages of being part of the UK will be obvious. Okay, fishing was a disappointment to many Scottish fishermen, but at least if the British government conducts its policy properly, the advantages for the fishing industry will increase, and the dangers of breaking away will increase. And I think also there's I compared Scotland with Catalonia. it didn't end happily for the Catalans because the EU was not willing to support the breakup of one of its member countries. Now, will the EU be willing to support the breakup of post-Brexit Britain? That would be a very dangerous course of action for the EU. And I think would be rightly seen by any UK government as an unfriendly act. And now we have a deal with the EU. It seems to me very unlikely that the EU would want to push things in that direction.
Yes.
But if it did. Scotland, unlike Catalonia, and I have Catalan friends who are strongly pro-independence. One of the things they always say is, we're a rich province. We're constantly giving money to the rest of Spain. If we were independent, we wouldn't have to do this anymore. Of course, for Scotland, it's, as you implied by referring to the Barnett formula, it's exactly the opposite. So the Scots would have to be saying, we're going to break away from a country that, in fact, subsidizes us and with whom we do most of our trade. This would be a suicidal act, it seems to me. And I don't think the Scottish electorate would go for it.
What is it about the English that draws us into enjoying being the underdog? Whilst the Scottish sort of, as I said, that sort of romantic vision of independence, of Scotland standing alone, of this romanticised nationalism, whilst we in England seem to long for cynical defeatism. Is that a fair characterisation?
Well, let's say it is. And I think there's some truth in that. We all know George Orwell said about the English intelligentsia,
yes.
not being patriotic. Now, I have a sort of playful hypothesis about this, which is partly based on a comparison with my second country, France. In France, the intelligentsia, the left-wing intelligentsia, rather sees France as its own creation. The French Revolution, the Republic, and all that. This is, if you're a French intellectual, it's ours. This is our country. We made it. It follows our ideas. If you're a British left-wing intellectual, well, in a sense, you're pretty marginal to British history. We think of the Crown, we think of Parliament, we think of the people. We don't think of the intelligentsia as having made Britain. And so I guess there may be a sense of, alienation because we're not. You often hear this from British intellectuals. In France, people like Jean-Paul Sartre were regarded as great figures, and nobody takes any notice of us. It's not quite true, but there's this sense that somehow we're not really part of this whole story. That would be my playful hypothesis. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, I think it may be it's one of the burdens we have to bear for having had a history as a powerful nation and a former empire in which we are identified by many people with rule, with force, with power. And therefore, if you want to see yourself as in some senses a revolutionary or against the system, then you're going to see England as part of the system. It's because we have been very powerful. Indeed, we still are rather powerful, that people can see it. The same can be said for the United States. Whereas if you're a country like Scotland or indeed Catalonia, or you can identify your nation with the struggle against global power. And therefore, it's easy for the romantic left to attach itself to certain kinds of nationalism and to see itself as always opposed to other kinds of nationalism or other kinds of national identity. And I suppose those would be my simple answers.
To end then, I wonder, Robert, if you might, I guess, get on your soapbox, as it were, and explain what you think, were this country to be wiped off the face of the earth tomorrow, if let's say Greta is right and the UK is going to either, I don't know, we'll all drown to death, be burnt alive, or an asteroid's going to hit us imminently, so on and so forth. What do you think the world, assuming they survive, what do you think the world would remember about the people of these islands?
I think that's probably a fairly easy question to answer. It would be our language. The first time in the history of the world that a language has become universal. And as long as we use language in a way that human beings have always used language, then we should be remembered. Of course, it could be that in 50 years' time, everybody will have little gadgets that enable them to speak their own language and it be immediately translated into all other languages, in which case we shall all speak some kind of world, some artificial intelligence world language. Maybe that will happen. But until it happens, people will have to think, well, the language we speak, the words into which we put our thoughts, come from this little island off the coast of Europe. And those people, they might say, well, I wonder who they were. Who were these people who gave us the language? But I think that would be my answer.
Well, that's a beautiful way to end today's recording. Thank you so much, Robert. When is the book out? It's the 28th
January.
I'll put a link to it in the description as well, and I would urge people to check it out because you are you are so fantastic at communicating ideas, and even someone like I, Robert, can get my head around them. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Not at all, not at all. Now, I'm sure you'll be absolutely desperate to, one, click that link that I mentioned in the description, but also to hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. I'll see you next time. Reasoned relies upon grassroots donations from people like yourself that want us to continue producing our high quality, free thinking content. So please do consider clicking the link and donating, no matter how big, no matter how small, because it really does ensure that we can keep on keeping on.